Then Ambassador Nishimura. If I may give you my personal view, six or 7 years ago, when I was involved as a negotiator for climate change, Alf, of course, have been involved many years before. So he is many years senior to me as a negotiator. So I am always learning from him. I'm listening carefully and learning from him always. And in most part, he's saying something very right and correct. And what he said today is also very right. But there's something, a couple of things that I would also like to mention. When I first started my job, I had strong conviction, the conviction which persists till today. The issue of climate change, of course, there is the mitigation question, how to mitigate the CO2 emissions, but at the same time, the developing countries, especially the developing countries in poverty, this is a question to do with the development and growth of the developing economies as well. And looking at the major argument behind this, I'm not going into the details of that, but thinking about the climate change issue, we also need to address the poverty, the energy poverty, energy supply poverty, not only that, but there is the term energy large, poverty large, that I myself am convinced that it is also to do with the poverty issue, the poverty writ large, that is. Because there are certain arguments that you need to decouple with the poverty question, but I cannot really agree to this view. The point I'm trying to make here is the poverty question, the funding question, how to provide financing for the developing countries. This is equally important as compared to the question of mitigation. But even so, looking at the present existing system, it is totally being dealt with as a different question. So if we are to build a new regime, a new system, perhaps it may be created in line with the existing system. If that is to be the case, the climate financing question will be treated as totally separate question. Why is it separate and different? The industrialized countries, for the climate fund that industrialized countries are asked to contribute to the fund. And I believe that industrialized countries should contribute. But I myself, in relation to the United Nations, in the year 2020, $100 billion is to be provided to the fund. That is the agreement. But how can this be realized? I'm also a member of the committee under the United Nations, and I have been involved in the debate. And naturally, industrialized countries should, I'm sure the industrialized countries do have the genuine intent that they would like to do so, but whether this is achievable or not, because of the difficult economic circumstances of the whole world economy, the $100 billion by the year 2020, the amount itself is not adequate enough even. According to the World Bank report, you may need 4 times or 5 times the large amount of money actually. That is the analysis given by the World Bank. So this is hugely a serious question. And from and beyond 2020, what kind of regime to be created unless you can tackle this financing the question? I don't think you will be able to genuinely bring a solution to the question. I'm quite concerned with this. There is another point I would also like to make. For the past 17 years, I'm not sure how many years more we will be engaged in, but in any case, the regime that we have been involved with, this is based upon the responsibility of the governments, the national governments. And what kind of responsibility is placed on the national government? The emissions generated from the private sector companies, the governments are obligated to reduce the emissions coming from the private sector. If you would scrutinize this, my feeling is that in the world economy, that the government is trying so hard to directly and concretely to restrict and restrain and limit the activities of the private sector. I don't think there is that many other examples where the government will try to do so. For example, how to liberalize the trade? To what degree should we liberalize? And the national governments are also involved directly, but what they actually do is, in the WTO debate, for instance, what they are doing is to create an institutional system to make this happen. However, this is the only example for the climate change issue. Be it crude oil or iron ore or copper or whatever the resources, or it could be agricultural produce, the trade and transaction of these goods. Never ever the government has been involved in the debate for trade at the WTO. For example, the government has not been directly involved, but when it comes to the climate change, the government is given the direct responsibility, and the government have to be involved directly with the trade itself. I do not know why the system has been made so. When the debate originally started, the responsibility of the industrialized countries that were vociferously asked for, and I do accept that. But perhaps accommodation also need to be seen. And as a consequence of that, as I have said at the outset, for the developing countries, especially for the abject poverty states, the adequate and right amount of financing should also be provided. And that is also the very necessary element for the new process, the new framework. I'm not trying to say that we should exclude the government from the responsibility. And if we are to have the market to be totally responsible, the polluters to be totally responsible, polluters meaning you and I, by burning fossil fuels, we are benefiting from that. All of us benefiting from burning fossil fuels are responsible, and we need to respond accordingly. But to create a regime and system to make that happen, to have the polluters to be responsible, should be a better system. That is my personal view. And the details are given in the resume that I have already distributed to you. I will not be going into the details here, but the polluters, like us, are responsible, and by us taking responsive actions, that should be the way to go in bringing solutions. But polluters' responsibility, how to pursue the polluters' responsibility, if we can create a mechanism for that, I'm sure a huge amount of financing would be made available. And then such funds should be provided for the poor developing economies to try to move them out from abject poverty. So the responsibility of the national government, I do admit that governments do have the responsibility because of the historical developments. But in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years to come, whether the present regime is appropriate or not is something we need to question.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.